The issues that Professor Grubb will address today concern the so-called policy triad of technology, pricing and energy efficiency. Professor Grubb will argue for a new framing of the problem aligned with security and geopolitical concerns and a refreshed approach to international coordination based upon the needs of effective and efficient domestic implementation. This has always been one of the challenges: how do we link in what we do domestically with the necessary cooperation internationally? Professor Grubb gained his PhD from Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge and has worked at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and Imperial College as well as Cambridge. During this period, he was lead author for several reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, addressing the economic, technological and social aspects of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. He's testified on numerous UK parliamentary committee inquiries. He gave the keynote talk at the World Bank's 2006 Annual Bank Conference on Development Economics and initiated and chaired the Global Innovation Modelling Comparison Project, widely cited in both the Stern Review and IPCC Fourth Assessment. The research organisation he chairs, called Climate Strategies, has been credited with some of the most influential research on the development and design of the European emissions trading system. And please now join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Michael Grubb.
Well, thank you very much, Martine, to all of you for coming. And I realise I'm arriving at a time of considerable domestic debate. I think by introduction, I'd say that one thing that I very much became conscious of during my almost decade at Chatham House, where I headed the Energy and Environment Programme, is that this issue has, I think, a particularly nasty combination of being simultaneously both very political and very technical. And I think unless one understands the technical side of it, one can't make much sense of the politics. And so in the presentation today, I actually want to run through some pretty techie kinds of slides. I hope you will forgive me, but you will see emerging from that a thesis about where and how I think the world may be going. I can't claim much certainty about that because it's an extraordinarily complicated issue and because the world is actually changing very fast. I think faster, frankly, than any of us could have imagined on this issue. Really following the shocks of the big Copenhagen summit, the collapse of US efforts on this in the subsequent 6 months and so forth. For the 2 decades I've been in this business, looking back, we've been extraordinarily ignorant, or extraordinarily innocent about a lot of things. Actually, about the nature of the global economy and geopolitics much more broadly, and that then got reflected in certain assumptions we brought to the stage of action on energy and climate change. And so I've used this theme of the age of innocence of what have we learnt? And one thing is, this is a very tough issue indeed. I then want to move a little onto the scale and the nature of the challenge. I want to run through some some international trends in what I'll call the emerging divide. I then do want to zero in on what I see as the core policy triad of what's actually required to, if any country is serious about this issue. And then I want to suggest a bit of final looking around to look forward. So the age of innocence I capture, as I say, as a broader theme which spans roughly a quarter of a century, and a useful starting point is the collapse of oil prices in the mid-1980s, which in a sense was a victory of the West over OPEC, which was followed quite shortly by, in effect, the victory over communism. And the period extends, in my view, right up to the financial crisis, presaged, note, by massive rise in global oil prices, and there is still an economic debate about causal connection or not of the links there, and the various other events, including, of course, the climate-related events building up to the collapse of the Copenhagen negotiations. The beginning of this age, some of you here may recall Francis Fukuyama's statement that we'd reached the end of history. There were no longer any major ideological or resource-driven land conflict, etc. divides. It was a period of Western dominance based on the belief that we'd found the golden keys, that free markets could solve all the major problems, including those of resource and environment. In the middle of this age, the Economist ran a front cover basically proclaiming global oil prices would stay around $5 a barrel. I think we had an astonishing neglect of the emerging economies, looking back, and their significance for global resource economy, geopolitics. What I want to zero in a sense, is also picking up the theme that a significant part of our wonderful economic success during this period, unfortunately, did turn out to be debt-based growth. When we use that term, everyone thinks about money, but it was also growth based on debt in terms of gobbling up as fast as imaginable the easy oil in the world and dumping the output into the atmosphere. And neither oil nor the atmosphere are infinite, and that is now another debt that we're having to start to face up to. In terms of the data underpinning this age, in terms of emissions and population, I've captured it in this sense. Way back in those days, wasn't the world nice and simple? You had emissions basically clustered in not much more than 1 billion people in the industrialized world, ranging sort of in the range from a bit under 10 up to close to 20 tons per capita on the left-hand side. And in all the rest of the world, emissions per capita were really pretty trivial, and global emissions were dominated totally by the industrialized world. There's lots of things one can say about that chart. Of course, what you do see is enormous potential for global emissions growth if and as the developing world started to aspire to the way we used and emitted carbon in the West. And sure enough, that's what's been happening. So this is the 20-year update, same principle, and what we see now on the far left, emissions from North America and Australia, broadly tipping up to 20 tons CO2 per capita, which is a little bit of an increase on 20 years ago, not much. Eastern Europe, then you've got the other regions of Europe, Japan, etc., clustered much more around 10 tons per capita. Slight growth of population over the time, but of course the major population growth and economic and emissions growth has been dominated by the rise of the emerging economies. And of course, at some point in the last few years, a lot of political fanfare to the fact that Chinese emissions started to exceed US emissions. The maths is extraordinarily simple. You take quarter of the emissions per capita and multiply by a population 4 times as big. Pretty simple maths. But of course, what you do with the politics of that is then at the heart of the North-South divide. Does that mean it's still the US's problem because they're 4 times as big as China per capita, or it's a China problem because actually they're now bigger than the US emissions and growing much faster, and potentially they and the developing countries dominating the future of global emissions growth? The North-South axis is the essential fulcrum upon which the age of innocence was constructed in climate policy, and it was ultimately its downfall. And one thing I want to argue is that we are now entering a fundamentally new structuring of the international politics of climate change. Key beliefs of the age, along with my take-home looking back after 20 years. First belief was this is fundamentally a problem about how do you share a burden? How do you share the costs? It's not really, actually. It's a problem about some very complicated sets of decisions on policy, investment, risks and returns, in which I think it is now unambiguously true that it's driven much more by politics than by economics. And I'll come and illustrate that perhaps more in some of the points, some of the examples. The solution, universally agreed, at least on paper, and in the US State Department, if not certain other organs of US government, was that the solution had to be led by the industrialized world with others following. What we now see is very fractured action amongst the industrialized countries, with an enormous acceleration of the efforts of the emerging economies. Then in terms of the three policy pillars that I'll say a little bit more about later, energy efficiency, the belief was, well, it's an easy free lunch, it's all cost effective, it's great, it's easy. I think the evidence is it is actually very good for the economy, but it is not easy. It's actually really quite tough to get energy efficiency policy right, but it does deliver a lot if and when you can. That, if you're going to do carbon pricing, the aim was you're internalising an external cost. Its role is to drive low carbon investment through a price signal. Actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. And the, to some extent, alternative view, as in a way pushed forward as the dissident's answer to Kyoto, if I put it like that, was that technology is actually the key. Technology will save us. The establishment of the Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Technology. And there, I think the real insight is that it's talking about accelerating innovation, and accelerating innovation is a result of good policy. It's quite hard to force efficiently, and it's quite slow to emerge. One of the interesting things about the Cancun Climate Conference just a few months ago was that a few weeks beforehand, the APP was quietly buried. And I didn't see a single thing in any press, and most people have a clue that this grand alternative to Kyoto, at the same time that in effect Kyoto was largely buried, they also buried what was supposed to be its alternative structure. So, you know, where on earth does that leave us? What I've tried to do here is to pick up some of the more recent analysis on relations between emissions and the likely scale of temperature change, and put it in a slightly unusual way. So the vertical axis is the equilibrium global temperature change we expect to arise. The horizontal axis is cumulative carbon emissions. And is carbon, actually, just for the convenience of numbers, you'll see, not CO2. The temperature change is very closely coupled to the cumulative emissions of carbon or carbon dioxide. This is quite a convenient way for those techie people amongst us that like to avoid the complicated step of translating it to atmospheric concentrations and then talking about pathways, etc., etc. Give me the amount of carbon and a scientist can tell me roughly what the temperature implication would be within a substantial band of scientific uncertainty. The best guess, let's say we want a median chance of keeping below 2 degrees, the sort of the global political target that scientists strongly support and the G8 has broadly adopted, means that we can emit about 1 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And we've emitted about half of that in human history to date. The other half of it, quite interestingly, is actually significantly bigger than all of the carbon in conventional oil and gas reserves. I use those words very specifically. The world is not going to run out of carbon. There's lots of it in the ground, but it comes in different forms. At the bottom, what you see, I don't know if I have a pointer here, these are different estimates of reserves of conventional oil, of natural gas, of the carbon in these reserves. Coal, unconventional gas is coal reserves, and that's the rest of coal resources, which are approximately infinite. If you dig down in enough rock and clear enough stuff out of the way, you'll get at some solid carbon eventually somewhere. So you see that what we can in fact afford to do within this broad framework of getting up to 1 billion tons CO2 is probably run through the conventional oil and gas and a certain amount of coal. And then we may be around this 2 degrees ballpark. But if we dig a lot further into unconventional reserves, we can end up in big trouble. And the big trouble is not just that central red line, which is the best guess, but actually what sort of the more sophisticated analysis says is the real danger here is what lies in the margins, the nasty surprises that could await. And the probability of much higher temperatures shoots up very rapidly as one moves across this chart. Okay. What does that imply? I mean, I could talk for hours about the economics of extreme events and all that. I'm going to short circuit that by actually arguing that there are 3 conceptions of climate change going on here, as far as I can see. The first is actually a very human reaction. No, I don't see it, don't know, I don't really care, which sort of gets translated into a belief that it's all not proven, or what you don't know doesn't hurt you. We've lost some words there. I've been a little perhaps cynical in terms of how I've categorized the resulting strategy. But the point is that is actually what you'd expect in the first few decades of climate change, because there's a substantial natural variability, and for quite a long time as climate change proceeds, that additional driver is going to get lost in the noise. It seems to be one of the things that potentially that's happened in Australia with the extreme events of the last few months is people may be being kicked out of that don't see, don't know, don't care into, well, actually there are tangible and attributed costs, potentially. Of course, is the economist's view along the middle here, that you project forward, you estimate, you weigh the cost, you weigh the benefits, you want to act up to a, quote, social cost of carbon. Unfortunately, there is a massive, fascinating literature about what, where, and how do you measure the social cost of carbon, and as one of the more thoughtful observers said of this debate, we know the answer, and it's somewhere between $10 and $1,000 per tonne of carbon dioxide. Which is a rather wide range of uncertainty to do an optimal cost-benefit analysis about. Timescale, probably a few other decades as the impacts begin to dominate natural variability. The point is, at some point, for some societies initially and then much more globally, we may enter a zone of what are called disruption and securitization, in which you're no longer saying, yeah, can I please count these exact costs and do an optimal trade-off? You're saying, there are threats here to our security. There are threats here to personal security, to the stability of nation states, to the stability of global food supplies, various other interactions. And the dominant responsibility of nation state is to ensure the security of its citizens. Cost benefit in the sense of counting up beans goes out of the window when you're dealing with national security policy. Of course, there are political debates about how much you're willing to spend and so forth. But the fundamental response is you've got to contain the threat and defend your shores. And the analogy here is containment is you mitigate as much as you practically can to reduce all the risks that you don't know about but can keep the scientists awake at night. And you adapt to the rest as best you can. And as I said, ultimately I think that applies to all. We're running planetary risks here. But for some vulnerable sectors and countries, they're already beginning to feel a bit that way, and certainly see their own national security threatened in terms of some of the low-lying coastal or island zones. And it's not surprising that the CIA is actually very concerned about climate change. It's basically considered as a major threat multiplier. The problem is, of course, again, it's probably a generation in time between each of these three steps. So you have a major public policy problem in persuading publics who are kind of still residing at the first level to do something about impacts that will occur at the third level. And yet there's a vast amount of inertia in both the climate system and response. Now, I'm actually going to be running a little short of time here, so I'm not going to go too much into the economics of the next bit of the story, but I'm just want to give you a sense that for each of those three levels of conception of the problem, there are also levels of conceptions of the answers, or some of the options around energy efficiency, cheap, quick, substituting high for low carbon investments, broadly associated with carbon prices, and then longer term, what kind of infrastructure are we building, what kind of innovation are we seeking? There are different economic related tools around those three pillars. That is essentially a key part of the thesis that I'm putting forward here. I probably won't have time to go into the economics. I'll take that in questions. Let me just say, it's a very interesting research, which actually done many years ago, which is almost entirely incomprehensible to most ordinary mortals like us, about global energy systems modelling over the next century. I've boiled that down to a much simpler picture at the bottom, which is the world is now bifurcating in terms of the energy and carbon intensity of its energy systems. And it's bifurcating on the ridge of oil depletion, easy oil depletion. We all know what's happened to oil prices. We all know they can go up and down, and I'm sure that there'll be oscillations. But the fact is, this oil price rise has not been driven by the politics of OPEC. It's been driven by the sheer demand-supply shock associated with the rise of China and other emerging economies. It is alongside the increasingly desperate attempt to get more easy oil out and finding it's getting harder and harder. The exhaustion of the North American oil reserves was simply a precedent for the global pattern. And that is going to make oil unstable, volatile, difficult. And you can have two responses. You can get higher carbon solutions, you invest in synfuels, tar sands, oil shales, and boy, we can learn how to do that stuff cheaply. We can learn how to mess up the atmosphere a lot more cheaply than with present technologies. Or you can put the effort into low carbon economies, renewables, maybe the nuclear, hydrogen, electric vehicles, and so forth. That is a bifurcation, it's a public policy choice. Is one obviously much cheaper and more expensive than the other? Well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of innovation. What you probably can say is the low carbon energy systems are more capital intensive, but much less fuel intensive. And high carbon systems are the opposite. So do you want a system that takes a lot of capital, but you're then pretty well insulated against international energy price shocks and fuel price volatility, or do you want it the other way around? The answer, I think, and I'll argue, depends a lot upon where the resources lie and whether it's producer or consumer nations. Brings me to my third topic, international trends and the emerging divide. You may have noticed on those earlier charts I showed, remarkable degree of stability in per capita emissions in industrialized countries, most. That is captured in this chart, which actually shows over time, which is the squiggly lines, the development of various countries in terms of vertically per capita emissions again, horizontally economic wealth. What you actually see is that in fact it is the industrialized countries that took on Kyoto caps at roughly the time of the agreement, so EU and Japan notably, have kind of battled along at around $10 per tonne of CO2, with some reductions, notably in some of the higher emitters that started there, like Germany. France has managed to stay substantially lower. The idea that all countries have been growing emissions per capita is just wrong. I mean, there's been very stability and significant reductions in some of the Kyoto countries over the decade or so. Obviously, you see countries in a much earlier stage of industrialization are increasing. The majority of them have not sort of breached that 10 tons per capita rough level indicated amongst that group of industrialized countries. What a contrast with the United States and indeed Australia, which has shot rapidly up to join the ranks of the US and Canada, in fact, in terms of emissions. One of the points I'll just add about that, though, is quite interesting. As I was looking through that data, I thought, wow, actually, UK and Australia, for the purpose of this talk, have been very similar in terms of per capita GDP over that period, matched pretty closely, at least on the period of that data. But boy, what different patterns in emissions. Now, that obviously reflects a lot of things, including UK policy choices, the dash for natural gas in the UK, a degree of deindustrialisation from Margaret Thatcher's reforms, sharp contrast with Australian growth on commodity-based exports. Not surprising there's a difference, but there are other factors in there as well. And I can see I'm going to have to... two more minutes to keep going. Okay. So finally, what do I make of this in terms of big picture? Who's acting? Oh, very interesting. Who is acting? EU, carbon cap and trade scheme for 6 years, and whatever the press says, pretty happy with it. It's got better over time. Hardly any stakeholders, industry or other, in Europe want to stop the EU ETS. It's cemented into the European political system now and will continue. California is moving ahead. Huge political battle at the same time. The federal systems collapsed. There was a vote in California which reinforced the political mandate for California to act with cap and trade analysis. Brazil is increasingly fashioning its economy as the developing world's low-carbon economy, biofuels and renewable energy producer and exporter. You've got another tier, led by South Korea, huge swathe of investment in their green growth recovery package. India appears to be rapidly shifting towards low-carbon development trajectory. In the next talk I'm giving, I'll be telling a little bit about their domestic trading scheme. Probably China too. I don't want to say much about China. I suspect you hear far more about China here than I know. I tend to just I find China incredibly complicated. I deal with the rest of the world, really. But I mean, it has low carbon development zones which have, tens of millions of population. The 5-year plan recently announced has a strong environmental theme and a strong low carbon technology development theme. Energy and carbon pricing is an essential part of the strategy in Europe, renewables core in Brazil, and EU, emergent Asia, where it seems that there is a combination of instruments focused really upon low carbon industrialization. What's the common theme here? Well, I've given it away. They're importers. Why could California act when the US couldn't? Because they don't have domestic oil production, they don't have a massive car industry. The politics drives the policy choices. And that, I think, is now emerging as the new structural division in terms of response to climate change. It'd be nice to work on that political theme, but I think I have to take a brief final sidestep into the issue of carbon leakage. It's a very important political factor. I think it will increasingly drive international structures and incentives. Can't say much, but believe me, in any country, it is politically impossible to say, we're going to put a price of carbon on you, you may close down, take jobs abroad, and you'll still be emitting. That's a political no-no anywhere, right? Never mind how serious, realistic, etc. is it. It's just political systems just collapse in the face of that argument. So what they do in practice, where they have carbon pricing schemes, is they just give away shed loads of free allowances. They basically take the carbon costs out again to top it partly with the finance story. Unfortunately, exempting anything that happens to be able to threaten to move is not a sustainable way of trying to decarbonise our economy. The more you protect the carbon-intensive bits, the higher the costs loaded onto the rest of the economy. There's only one way out of that in the long run, which is you have to look at border carbon charges. In the case of Europe, primary issue is on imports. My guess is that this complete political no-no as of 18 months ago is going to be firmly on the agenda with a view to implementation by 2020, when the end of the EU ETS phase 3. The logical system would actually be for a carbon-added regulation, which each country charged for the carbon upon its bit of production, and then that got passed on, just in the way that value-added tax works. I suspect we're not going to get a big grand global deal on that, but we might negotiate the rules of systems like that amongst the emergent low-carbon coalition. I think the key question then is whether the emerging low-carbon coalition, and you'll note I've now switched entirely the political framing of this global issue from being a north-south divide to being a question about what is the economics and politics of an emergent low-carbon coalition, which is not a north-south divide, it's a north-south coalition of subdivides within each. And I think the key question is that going to be purely importer-driven, setting up rules that protect the importers through border adjustments, etc., or will there be any major producers that get on the low-carbon road and are at the table of how that regime is designed? I may be best to leave it there so there is some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, Harley Wright from Climate Sense. Appreciate your both physical and economic expertise for an interesting talk. You haven't mentioned contract and converge coming from Chatham House, perhaps surprising. Yeah, I feel like a slight sort of personal heretic in answering this, because my first publication at Chatham House 20 years ago basically said the only way I can see to solve this thing is through international emissions trading to give the flexibility and the resource transfers to developing countries, and that the most logical way of giving out allowances would be on a per capita basis. And that's the logical way and the ethical way and the sensible way, and for that reason it's never going to happen. For the simple reason there is no equitable, logical, fair, single, central, global decision maker that will say, yeah, this is the fair way to do it, we'll do it this way. So I haven't mentioned contraction and convergence, which is the slightly more sophisticated version of the same idea, because I see absolutely no point of connection between these global top-down divisions of how we should divide things
with the actual politics that I have witnessed and observed and sought to analyse during my career. I see no point of contact. On that way of framing it, the country that would clearly should do the most, have the most substantive reductions and make by far the biggest international transfers is, of course, the United States. Do you see the politics of that? Do you see that happening in Washington? Do you see a president saying, I'm going to declare the US will reduce its emissions by more than 80% and buy lots of international allowances to fund China, and please elect me at the next election? That's not how our world works. And I don't think that we're going to solve the climate problem by pretending there is a global, all-seeing, all-powerful decision maker that can impose those sorts of decisions.
Gentleman at the back here, and then here at the front.
Giles Parkinson from the website Climate Spectator. You mentioned about the border tariffs. I just wonder, I guess we've already seen that a little bit with India and its coal tariff it's imposed recently. I'm just wondering what you're suggesting might be the impact on Australia, because some of the debate in Australia is dominated by this idea that we should be taxing imports rather than putting on a price on our exports.
And the key point, first on the legal front briefly, is the WTO itself is at pains to emphasise they do not ban border adjustments. The WTO is a regime that defines what kind of border adjustments are compatible with the legal principles of the World Trading System. And in fact, the WTO is desperately trying to keep its head out of this debate because they do not want to be blamed by countries for being the obstacle to saving the planet. That's the last thing the WTO wants. In terms of the specifics, you can do things at a very simple level with a couple of commodities lend themselves to very simple treatment. Cement is the most obvious one. It's a pretty simple process, single type of product. You say, looks like cement, feels like cement, must have emitted at least this much. That's how much you've got to buy. That is very easy in world trade terms. When you start digging down into exactly how was this thing made, etc., it gets more complicated and you enter also more complicated legal terrain. Import adjustments fall under a different legal treatment than export adjustments. In Australia's position, I think that one of the things I'd certainly look at is whether and how to make a carbon pricing system qualify, as I think it would on the whole, as a direct cost that can be reimbursed upon export. It can get a little complicated, but under WTO, that's perfectly, like I say, we do it with VAT, we do it with excise taxes on petroleum. On imports, it's a slightly more complicated set of issues if you go beyond the sort of really simple benchmark cement example I gave. I think that since I expect the Low Carbon Coalition to be predominantly driven by importers, they would tend to be looking at that first and potentially charging and then seeking to charge imports of carbon-intensive goods, maybe from Australia, on the basis of an estimated carbon footprint. And providing you apply that same principle equally between countries, you can mount a pretty strong defence that that's compatible with WTO, but it does get more complicated.
Here at the front.
And also, if you go down the carbon added route, if Australia has already charged that card, not only are they likely to be more efficient in carbon, but also they can say, oh, this carbon's already been paid for in Australia, we'll keep the revenue, thank you very much, rather than you collecting it in Europe.
Hi Michael, Meg McDonald from Today Low Carbon Australia. I formerly Carbon Trust Australia. I'm interested in your views on the global governance issues around the kind of paradigm that you're suggesting, because, which I totally agree with, that countries are actually implementing these policies for a complex of drivers in addition to there being climate. So then how do you see that translating into a global regime? Because it's a very broad-ranging global regime which is going to be capable of taking this into account. And do we have the right instruments for governance of that, that achievable within the timeframes that you're suggesting we need to do so?
I think the comment that I'd make, which is an incomplete answer, is that I don't think any of this exactly replaces the need for relevance of global negotiations under the UN. First, I do find it implausible that we'll have some big global negotiating process which is not under the United Nations. I just don't quite see how you could ever get there, so I think we have what we have. My reading of the outcome of the Copenhagen-Cancun process, with the sort of huge shock about the collapse of US efforts in the middle, is that the collective sigh of relief after the agreement at Cancun last December reflected the sense that one had saved the only legitimate global negotiation process, and it had at least an element of credibility, and that it took the Copenhagen Accord into a secure UN-based legal framework so you could dispense with all of the procedural arguments about whether it had legitimacy, etc., etc. And in that sense, it rescued the ship. But when you look at the structure of what it was they agreed at Cancun, it's all soft law. None of it's binding. It's a list of country pledges defined in various sorts of ways, and, well, we'll do our best, and we want to be good boys here. In that sense, I felt Cancun was much more of a sort of an attempt to update the Framework Convention than it was any successor to the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, it doesn't have the teeth to drive anything very much. And specifically, I wrote an editorial for the Climate Policy Journal in which I ended up concluding that Cancun rescued the ship of the global negotiations, but it proved that politics is the art of the possible. The art of the possible at the UN level is a million miles away from where the science says we need to be, because essentially that ship lacks a motor. The question is, where does the UN ship get a motor from? And I think that's where the low carbon coalition stuff comes in, which is once you begin to collect a group of countries that are serious about this, they start to accrete political and economic weight, that will impact on the global negotiations. They may not even need a formal forum or regime to achieve that. I mean, if you start to aggregate EU, Brazil, India, maybe China, and the mass of other, some of the sort of the coalition of African and low island states, almost by definition, the role of importers grows over time as fossil fuel exports deplete. That has a lot of political clout, whether or not it has a formal regime behind it. You may just have a network of bilateral group deals on handling of carbon pricing across borders. Two final comments. So it's getting a long answer, but it was a very interesting question. One is Peter Drahos at ANU here has written a fascinating paper about the evolution of TRIPS and the World Intellectual Property Organization and its relationship to the WTO, and that it was engagement with the trade regime that really began to give it economic and political force. The other comment I had in Cancun talking with people from WTO was, they were kind of scratching their heads and saying, what's all this attempt to sort of suddenly negotiate out of the blue a global treaty to do something as difficult as this? Don't they remember how we got to the WTO? It's because 50 years ago, 22 countries said, sod these global negotiations on trade which are going nowhere, we're going to do it anyway. And that club of 22 countries is what then became the GATT process and led ultimately to the WTO. The only problem in two problems in climate change, one of which is people view it as economically impossible because who wants to agree on a coalition to share costs? I've argued that is just fundamentally wrong economic framing. If you think that way, you don't understand the economics, which makes the politics of building low carbon much more interesting. And so, I just find that is now very much the way that my thinking analysis is going, and my advisory work is, how do you construct a low carbon coalition that is politically and economically sustainable with rules that will make it grow rather than shrink?
Can I just tease out a little bit what you're suggesting? I thought I saw from your slides that the low carbon coalition was essentially composed of countries that were importers. Was that correct? Did I get that right? Because it strikes me, can you tease out a little bit more the idea that some exporters, high carbon exporting countries might join that coalition, or that they might themselves form a group among themselves to debate how best they could meet some of the targets and some of the penalties that might be coming ahead, and that you could have a sort of another type of interest coalition that could be a negotiating partner to your low carbon coalition.
what I tried to do is put the concept of low carbon coalition slightly separately from the importer-exporter, but to say that the default is importers are much more likely to go down that route, because one thing we've learned is the political weight of producer interests. I mean, one statistic I didn't mention is there was a paper which estimated about what happened in the US, and it estimated problems around methodology and attribution. Basically estimated the fossil fuel industry in the US spent $500 million on lobbying against the domestic cap and trade program. And I was speaking to one of the global engineering companies, and they said, and they backed the US cap, etc. And they just said, it never dawned on them as they'd send that much. They simply outgunned us. But ultimately it's a matter of national choice. The point is that a carbon resource intensive country like Australia could still choose to go down a low carbon route. It could still choose to do the stuff required on energy efficiency, pricing, innovation, and also recognise that its domestic resource base is a mix of coal, gas, and solar. Gas is a short-term, medium-term winner in low-carbon coalition, and the choice between solar and coal-based innovation is a strategic choice. A country like Australia does have that choice at its disposal, but the politics of the current incumbents make it very difficult. That's the point I'm making.
A very warm thank you to our speaker, Professor Michael Grubb.